So let me briefly introduce the panel, and then we'll hear from each of them. You've seen the biographies in the information about tonight's event, but let me summarise briefly, if you will. Professor Geoff Maitland has had a distinguished career both in academia and industry, and has moved between those two domains to build an interesting set of experiences. He's a specialist in oilfield engineering, in clean fossil fuels, and carbon storage, and also presently president of the Institute of Chemical Engineers. We'll hear from Francis Egan. He's had a long experience in upstream oil and gas exploration, including senior positions in companies, and from 2012 has been chief executive of Quadrilla, a company that's relatively small, but it's become very well known for its activities in unconventional oil and gas. We'll hear from Nick Riley. He's a wealth of experience with the British Geographical Society, looking at carboniferous rocks, and now runs his own company as a consultant in that area. And fourth member of our panel, Jane Burston, leads a large team on carbon measurement within the National Physical Laboratory, and struck also by the, and that's with an emphasis on measuring emissions from extraction processes. But also struck by the role she has in NGOs and in advisory panels across the climate change field. So terrific panel, and without further delay from me, I'd like to invite Geoff to give some opening remarks.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, everybody. So in the few minutes I've got, I just want to set out what I think are some of the issues. I will nail my colours to the mast straight away and say that I am a supporter of exploiting shale gas in the UK and across the world. And I just want to say what I think are some of the issues involved in that decision. The issues are complex, and I think they require good debate, balanced debate, both about the technology, the economics, and the regulation, and the way that this is worked out through communities and society. So this is about the future of the shale gas in the UK. And so I start from the premise that I believe that although our target should be to move to carbonless fuels and energy with as near zero emissions as we can as quickly as possible, and that our long-term solution there is going to be renewables and a large part played by solar, that we are many decades away from being able to achieve that destination. And so I feel that at least for the next, say, 50 years, we will need to continue to use fossil fuels if economies are going to grow, if the quality of life and aspirations across the world are going to be achieved. So given that premise that we need to continue to use fossil fuels, we need to use them as cleanly as possible. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to use gas. So I see gas as being a major part of our energy future, because if we burn gas, we produce 50% of the carbon dioxide that we produce by burning coal or using oil for the same equivalent amount of energy or unit burnt. So gas, I think, has a great future, not only as a fuel in its own right, but also we can base our whole petrochemicals industry on gas, and we can also go from the other raw materials, solid fossil fuels, and even biofuels, through gasification, through the gas route, to fuels, chemicals, as well as energy. So why shale gas? Well, if you look at that in the context of, say, the UK, the North Sea is in decline. Only about 40% of the gas we need for our current use is produced at home. We import a large amount of the gas we use either from Norway or as LNG from the Middle East and other parts. And so in terms of security of supply, if we're going to use more gas, as I believe we should, by not only replace existing gas by shale gas, but to actually replace coal by gas, then I think we're going to have to use whatever gas supplies we have indigenously here, very similarly to what happened in the United States. Now, we're not going to replicate, I think, what happened in the United States here. The shales and the gas there is different in terms of how we can release it. Probably the content is higher. It's going to be more difficult to remove. So, but if we just look at what's happened in the States, they've gone in a decade from being in a situation where they're net importers of gas to where they're on the verge of being net exporters. They've replaced a lot of their coal by gas, and in a country that has not necessarily embraced carbon mitigation targets wholeheartedly, almost like Newton sitting under the apple, they, at a stroke, have actually met their carbon mitigation targets by driven economically and strategically by this shale gas bonanza that they've been able to exploit. I think so in terms of security of supply and being able to secure the long-term future of the cleanest fossil fuel is very important. Now, in terms of why should we get it from the shale and how should we do it, there are, of course, very important issues in terms of the technology that we use. It's been enabled by two technologies. One gets all the headlines, that is hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's called. And not everybody's aware that this is a technology that's been around for 50 or 60 years. So this is quite a refined technology. We're not making up technology on the hoof here. And the issues about where the fractures go, how you create them, the toxicity of the fluids that are used are very well studied, but answers need to be given to the questions that are raised about where are these fractures going, are they connecting with aquifers, are the fluids safe, are we producing seismic events that are dangerous by the hydraulic fracturing. All those things, those concerns need to be addressed. The other issue is if you like, the invasion of the locality in terms of what it requires to produce, to put wells in place to then produce the shale gas. And undoubtedly, you know, there is a short-term environmental impact there and invasion of sometimes in areas that have not been exposed to industrial activity. I think in the former coal mining areas, the Midlands and the North, where there is shale gas, the attitude may be slightly different than it is in say, in southeast England. But nevertheless, those concerns have got to be addressed. And I think both the concern about health and safety and long-term environmental effects and the short-term effects in terms of the access to land and the compensation that can be given to local communities are very real issues. And I think some of the things the government's been doing in terms of compensation for producing shale gas locally and then some charge on each well that's drilled that goes to the local community, along with some percentage of the revenues, is getting towards some sort of balance between benefit versus sacrifice, if you like. And I think the environmental benefits, the environmental concerns about fracking have been voiced very, very widely. This needs to be balanced about this large environmental benefit to us all of if we exploit the shale gas and then use it rather than coal, we actually reduce CO2 emissions by 50%. I don't think we should stop there. I think all gas used centrally should then be linked to carbon capture and storage so that we get to as near carbon neutrality as possible. And so I think those are very important issues that need debate and that both the technology and the local concerns need to be addressed with as much transparency and information as possible. So I think those are the issues I'd like to set on the agenda. I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will bring other ones as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity for speaking here. I was saying, just as I arrived, it's been quite a few years since I've been in a lecture theatre like this, and it's brought back quite a few memories, not all of them pleasant. And those of you who are sitting final exams or have just had final exams, I'm sure will share that that feeling, particularly this time of year. I remember thinking whenever someone started mowing a lawn, I thought that means exams, and that stuck with me for so long. Just about going, it's coming back now. I'm going to say a little bit, which is overlapping, in fact, with what the professor has just spoken about. Why are we exploring for shale gas in the UK? The UK, gas has been an important part of the energy mix in the UK since the 1960s. But whenever you talk about energy in the UK, particularly when the media talk about energy, it's almost invariably straight onto electricity, and then in the flash of an eye, it's onto the lights going on or the lights going off. But what I think people don't adequately realise is that for gas, electricity is actually a minor part of the story. Most of the gas that we use in this country has got nothing to do with electricity. And in fact, if we were to generate all our electricity with renewables tomorrow, we'd still be using 3/4 of the gas that we're using today. Because the primary uses for gas in the UK are for heating our houses, for heating our businesses, for cooking our food, and as an industrial feedstock. And I warrant to guess that if we took a show of hands and asked how many people in this room use gas at home, virtually all of you would put your hands up. 84% of houses in the UK use gas for heating. And that's why I share the professor's view that we are not going to stop using gas in 2030. The only case I've seen that says we are relies on a 60% reduction in demand with no explanation of how we're going to get a 60% reduction in demand. So I think you have to separate out wishful thinking for a good outcome to reality. So the reality is we will be using gas beyond 2030s. The question is where are we going to get it from? And we have a choice. We can continue to import it. At the moment we import about half our gas. Most of that at the moment coming from Holland and Norway, but increasingly further afield in liquefied form from Qatar, North Africa. And of course, as Holland and Norway themselves move into decline, the requirement to bring it further afield will increase. And ironically, people are now talking about importing shale gas from the US to the UK. If we end up in a situation where we're importing shale gas from the US rather than developing our own resources, we will be insane, in my mind, from an economic point of view and from an emissions point of view. In the UK, as I said, the North Sea is running out of gas at a pace, and the estimate is by 2030 we'll need to import most of our gas. In the north of England, and I'm sure the next speaker, who's an expert on this, will be able to verify this, the BGS has got a mid-case estimate of about 1,000 to 1,030 trillion cubic feet of gas in the ground. Now, nobody knows how much of that can be got out of the ground. That is the whole point of Quadrilla's applications to drill exploration wells in Lancashire. It's to establish what percentage of the gas in the ground can be got out of the ground. And I'm sure lots of people in the audience here have got different views about that, and everyone's got a different view, but nobody wants to drill a well. And until you drill a well and actually measure it and begin to measure it over time, it's just talk. And we're very good at talk, but not too good at action. And we will be faced with a choice, and we can import it. We will not stop using gas. People will not turn off the central heating system. You will not go home and switch off your heating system this winter. And it will not be supplied, your heating will not be supplied by renewables, in my view. I'm sure there'll be people who will take a different view in the audience, but that's my view. We have a lot of gas in the UK. We can either choose to develop it responsibly here, and I believe that British engineering, and this university is a fine example of the best of British engineering, has the capacity to do that in a way that no other country in the world can do. And we can do it here. And be a benchmark not just for the UK but for Europe. Or we can import it from Russia, from Algeria, from Qatar. I've worked in all those countries. I can tell you if I was measuring the emissions and I wanted to know it was getting done well, I would do it here in a heartbeat ahead of any of those. I think I've probably used most of my 5 minutes, so I'll stop there because this is really about you and your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll turn to Nick Riley.
Okay. I'm Nick Riley. I worked for over 30 years with the British Geological Survey, mainly mapping carboniferous rocks through a lot of that time. And about the last 13 years there, I was involved a lot in research on carbon capture and storage, particularly CO2 storage underground. I was involved in setting up the very first European research network, CO2 GeoNet, on that. The only way forward for fossil fuels is to decarbonise them, and gas is a perfect fuel for being decarbonised. I'm going to touch on really take off from where Francis was, unless we actually explore, we won't really know what we're doing. And a lot of the arguments we hear in the media and by the politicians and commenters in, by various protesters, they're really cart before horse, because we actually don't know whether we can produce the gas at commercial rates in this country. So we haven't done a frack in this country since 2011. And unless we do fracks, we will never know whether we can produce the gas from the ground. So that's one of the fundamental things in my talk. And I'm going to then address some of the common things you read about, particularly when people are interviewed on the TV, and the protesters and people like that make certain points. The British Geological Survey, who I work with, has now produced 3 reports. Not everything's come up actually on here, I don't know why. I may have loaded the wrong one, never mind. We have 3 reports out now. Midland Valley of Scotland came out at the end of June, and then the Big Bowland Shale report came out a year ago, July last year, and then the Weald report down in southern England. I'm pointing to that, which I shouldn't be, should I? Sorry, that, I feel like the weather forecaster. That came out in May. But it's the Bowland Shales I'm going to mainly talk about. There's no shale gas thought to be present onshore in the Weald Basin, so we'll leave that alone. There's a lot of shale oil. The Bowland study came out with the figures that are actually there. The central estimate's 1329 TCF. We use about 3 TCF a year of gas in this country. So if you only manage to produce 5% of that 1329, that just sort of tells you the amount of gas that's just coming from that one area of the Bowland Shales onshore UK. These shales, by the way, go out under the Irish Sea, they go out under the North Sea as well. But people aren't going to go into the offshore areas until we prove the technology onshore with our geology, I'm sure. And there is shale gas also in the Midland Valley of Scotland, but a much smaller volume than in the Bowland Shales. Okay. The House of Lords came out with this report in May this year, and they say, same thing I've just said and what Francis has just said, unless we explore, we're wasting our time speculating. And one of the blocks to exploration has been to abide by the letter of the law and not by the spirit. And so hence the man with the snail, not breaking the law, doing what he's doing, but he's certainly forcing the law by the letter of the law. We know an awful lot about the geology of these shales. They outcrop all over the Pennines. We know about the interaction of those shales with our water supplies. Preston gets all its water from the Bowland Shales, water that flows over the Bowland Shales. There's water flowing out of those shales into the salmon rivers. I can take you to them and you can see some of the fluids coming up out of the shales into the rivers. How do the young salmon get back, the mature salmon get back to the rivers to breed? They smell the chemistry of the rivers. That's been going on since and between different ice ages and interglacials, including the current interglacial we're in. That dog there is my gas sniffer, by the way. We've been drilling for oil and gas in this country for over 100 years. I live in the East Midlands. Durham University have a project called Refine. They recently did a very interesting paper published looking at incidents of leakages from wells. They concluded that fracking itself, there is no definitive evidence anywhere in the world that water supplies are being contaminated by fracking. However, there is evidence from surface spills and from the failure of the shallow sections of wells, the vertical part of the well that is near the surface, the engineering. They also said we don't really know about UK onshore wells that have been, the highest density is in the East Midlands. We've got oil and gas wells there. We've got coal exploration wells there. And so I looked at the statistics for water pollution events in East Midlands. This is from the Environment Agency, and you can't find oil and gas in there at all. This is for 2009. In fact, it's the water companies themselves that are the biggest polluters, and then the waste disposal companies, presumably because they're operating landfill sites, and the farmers, because they're putting a lot of chemicals on the ground. So you have to put these things in context about, what are the big threats to our aquifers, things that already go on. If we take up the argument that, well, we shouldn't be investing in shale gas, we should be investing in renewables, which is a very common message from the anti-frackers. If you look at Germany, Germany has spent, by last October, over 100 billion euros in subsidising renewables, yet only 10% of Germany's primary energy demand comes from renewables. In fact, renewables is not reducing Germany's emissions at all. All it's doing is backfilling as Germany retreats from nuclear. So Germany's standing still with all its investment in renewables in actually cutting emissions. It just shows you how difficult it is to go to a renewables energy efficiency future, which a lot of the anti-frack and the NGO people want, and claim we can decarbonise our electricity system by the 2030s. That's going to be absolutely impossible. Germany shows this. And Germany's already locked into a lot more subsidy. The real issue for renewables, if it really is going to get far, is energy storage. And there's a certain cap that you get to with renewables. If you don't have sufficient storage, that you can't get above that threshold. And that's what's going to hold things back. Now, the anti-frack campaigners use fear. Fear is used a huge amount to stall the development of this technology and deployment in the UK. And there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, and it's not just in shale gas technologies, it's all other underground technologies, like I worked a lot in underground CO2 storage. And it's quite bizarre that in Germany, they're outside the Parliament building, they're saying you can't store CO2 safely underground, when under Berlin there's one of the largest underground gas storage facilities in Europe, which keeps Berlin warm in winter. But the Gasland movie, commonly shown over and over and over and over again, is nothing to do with fracking. That was methane already in the groundwater. So there's a lot of misinformation. And the big problem is if the anti-frackers are successful in damaging the confidence in subsurface technologies, they will actually damage their own cause of bringing renewables in, because it's the subsurface where we're going to have to store a lot of our energy from renewables in the form of compressed air, in the form of synthetic methane, in the form of hydrogen. And it's very interesting that the Independent Committee on Climate Change sees there's a long-term role for gas in this country, and we can still meet our climate targets, providing we have CCS by the 2030s. And the UK is actually on the threshold of having a world-first demonstration at full scale of carbon capture and storage on a gas-fired power plant. So let's hope that goes ahead. So the destination's the same. I want the same destination as a lot of the protesters. Being a geologist and a scientist and earth scientist, I know that climate change is a real threat. I also know ocean acidification is a real threat. And we do have to decarbonise. But I don't think that there is a single trajectory. I think we have to have a multifaceted trajectory to get there, because it's so hard. And I just wish people would be more pragmatic and cooperative rather than confrontational, use evidence-based policy, and solve problems when there is a problem, rather than, we can't do this. That just brings paralysis and, entrenched positions. And we'll never know what can be realised about our shale gas resource, which is very huge, without exploring and testing our shales. So let's stop putting carts before horses. I actually think shale gas could herald, not just as a fuel for transition, but an infrastructure for renewables transition. Just think of all those wells that could be taken over as geothermal wells eventually, after the shale gas resource has been depleted. Have intelligent completions of those wells. Just also think there'll be a gas grid put in northwest England, where a lot of cow slurry is stored, that could form a biogas network when we deplete the resource of shale gas. So, clever thinking could mean that all this investment actually is investing into a renewable future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you. So, as was mentioned, I'm from the National Physical Laboratory. I don't know how many of you have come across us, but we're the National Measurement Institute for the UK. And I'm going to talk about the carbon footprint of shale gas compared to other forms of energy production. And I was going to talk through three things. First of all, what different studies have said the carbon footprint is. Secondly, how those studies have measured or calculated the footprint. And thirdly, what could be done about mitigating the fugitive emissions. So first up, what the footprint is. There's no doubt that natural gas is cleaner in combustion than coal and oil. It's about 25 to 30% less carbon dioxide than oil, and about 40 to 50% less carbon dioxide than coal. So it's already way ahead in carbon footprint terms in combustion. And combustion makes up most of the carbon footprint of energy generation. Other elements of the footprint include the volume of water that's used and the water treatment the transport, particularly the large amounts of transport of water, and then leaks and venting. And within all of those things, it's the leaks and venting that's the largest part of that portion of the emissions. And there's been quite a lot of focus on it. It's all been kicked off by a paper from the University of Cornell in the US that suggested that the footprint of shale gas might be higher than that of coal in certain circumstances. And it's worthwhile kind of understanding the way that they've calculated that and the sorts of things that they're looking at. They're basing their calculations on and the concern on the fact that the global warming potential of methane is high, and all of these different studies actually confusingly use slightly different global warming potentials for methane. The most commonly used one is the number of 25 times as bad as carbon dioxide, which is from the IPCC assessment report 4. Now, in the latest one, that's gone up to 28, and that's the impact over a 100-year time frame. Additional confusion is added in by the fact that this year, in this IPCC report for the first time, they've included for methane the climate carbon feedbacks, which have always been included for carbon dioxide, but never previously before for methane. And if you include those, then the global warming potential of methane over 100 years goes up to 34 times as bad as carbon dioxide. So I think everybody acknowledges methane leaks are a big issue. So back to Cornell, the types of fugitive emissions over the lifetime of a well are typically expressed in the percentage of the gas produced that has been leaked or vented. And Cornell calculated that it would be about 2 to 4% over the lifetime of the well leaked or vented. That's compared to the US inventory, which has the number at below 2%. So that kicks off a huge scientific debate in the US, and there's been a number of kind of life cycle assessments done, and now a program of actual physical measurement to see whether that would be validated. One of the things that we're looking at the National Physical Laboratory is that most of these studies have not been based on real-world measurement. So they're models, they're making assumptions about the flow rate. Some of the higher assumptions have been challenged in the literature. And they're also making assumptions about, given certain flow rates, what the leaks would be. But very few, especially of the early studies, were actually going to the site and seeing what the methane concentrations in the atmosphere were. As well as the global warming potential and confusing the numbers, some of the studies use leak rates for the whole gas supply chain. So I think some people hear quotes of the leak rates up to 8%. That includes the whole of the gas supply chain, so transmission, distribution, any storage. And that's, it's comparable if you're comparing it to coal to include the whole gas supply chain, but not if you're comparing it to conventional gas. Because if you're comparing it to the leak rates from conventional gas, you're going to need to add in all of those leaks from the rest of the gas system that have been included in these shale gas studies. And one of the other issues has been the lack of a baseline. So in the US now, there are measurements taking place, atmospheric measurements from people driving around with analyzers or flying over the tops of shale formations and wells in a plane. But the problem is we didn't know what the atmospheric concentrations in those areas were beforehand. So it's very difficult to compare, and there's obviously a number of other sources of methane in the atmosphere: local landfill sites, agriculture, natural leaks from the area. When it comes to measuring things in the UK, obviously without a live site, there hasn't been anything to measure. But we're working with Quadrilla on plans for a project that's been funded by the Climate Kick, EU source of funding, run through Imperial actually, to use our differential absorption LiDAR facility on the first 2 Quadrilla sites that come online to measure the emissions from all different stages of the process. We're also helping to develop through that project boundary fence techniques monitors that can be put in place on an ongoing basis to help feed this information into the UK's inventory. And hopefully measurements of that kind and as other operators come on stream can help to support both the UK reporting into the inventory, but also the production of emissions factors, because to be honest, the EPA even acknowledges at the moment people are pretty unclear what the emissions factors should be for shale gas. And then onto the third area of mitigation, how can these leaks be mitigated? There is a really large potential to mitigate the leaks. It's more than 90% if you do what's called green completions, a kind of broad term for all of the different things that you can do at the completion stage to make the thing more environmentally friendly. And there's various reports. The Environment Agency have done an incredibly comprehensive one going through all of those different options and the potential costs of those. There's obviously, as been mentioned by the other speakers, other ways to reduce the footprint of the gas that we're using more at the end use, so things like carbon capture and storage or the energy efficiency if for domestic heating. And we need to remember to bear those in mind when we're talking about reducing the carbon footprint of gas use. So I think to finish up, I'd make 3 recommendations for what ought to be done in this particular area of the carbon footprint going forward. And it really echoes the recommendations that DEC themselves have written about in their most recent report. One is that we do need new emissions factors. So as more sites come online, the measurements that have been taken so far are small in number and they've got very large uncertainty. So we need a much higher volume of actual real world measurement to be able to come up with emissions factors that we can use. Secondly, where the emissions factors already exist, so where many parts of the process for extracting shale gas are similar to conventional gas, we can apply those emissions factors, but we do need to know the content of the gas, that's the composition of the gas, because the evidence is that for shale gas, it's there's a larger mix of gases than conventional gas. So accurate gas composition is going to be required to apply those existing factors. We also really need a baseline. One of the main things that US academics and the EPA and the main NGO that's funding studies in the US, the Environmental Defense Fund, have said is they wish they had taken a baseline before any of this happened, because it's quite difficult to really compare, well, it's impossible to compare what would have happened, what was happening before in the atmosphere to what's happening now. So we need to make sure we do that. And then finally, we need a way of measuring how good the mitigation is and then sharing the options for mitigation around the industry. I think the UK Onshore Operators Group is already set up to do that, but there are some very good large-scale voluntary programs in the US, like the Natural Gas Star program, that I think the UK could adequately adopt and push out among companies in this country as well.
Okay, we'll move to take some questions. We have some roving microphones, which I've lost sight of at the back. I'll ask you to use the microphones because the acoustics of the room mean that the rest of the audience really need to hear it through the mics to get the question. That's an important part of the debate. I'm planning to take questions in groups of 3 and then field them to the panel as a way of making sure we get a number of people to contribute. And if you could frame your contribution as a question, rather than not looking for statements particularly, but for questions to the panel. Where am I going first? We've got a number. So there's a gentleman there. Go first.
Will Griffiths from the Carbon Trust. I just want to know what the panel think about whose role it is to inform and educate the public, and to what end are Quadrilla already engaging with the sort of main advocacy groups against fracking.
Okay, we'll take another question in the back corner.
You've mentioned LNG, oh, Nick Dimitri from City Group. You mentioned LNG from the Middle East. You've got Cyprus and Israel coming on board as well very, very soon for LNG. Are you going to have to change your tactics when you work with the Middle East for rates and evaluations of oil fields and gas fields as well? Change of tactic and who you work with, all your strategic partners in the Middle East and the Mediterranean.
So that's about choice of partners in use of LNG. Okay. And we'll come to a question in the front row.
Yes, I wonder if from the panel somebody could say something about well integrity. And I think a lot of it about the idea of leaks is a big fear factor, obviously getting into groundwater and whatever. I've got a feeling the industry hasn't sold a very good story on that. I feel that maybe there is a better story to be sold. The other one, of course, is the chemicals used. I've got this horrible shuddering feeling down the spine when we hear that they won't tell you what the chemicals are because of commercial confidentiality. No, you can't get away with that. You've got the general public who are scared to witness about what's going to be put into their environment. You can't hide behind commercial confidentiality. And the wastewater after that. I'd like comments on those, please.
So I think actually the first point about public engagement and whose responsibility, I think maybe it would be nice to hear from everybody on that. I don't know, Geoff, do you want to kick us off perhaps?
Yes, I think the short answer, I think, is there's a range of stakeholders, from those interested in exploiting the shale gas, the government, and the NGOs who express concerns. I think that there's a shared responsibility, and I think, but then there needs to be more informed debate of the different points of the argument. And I think it needs more coordination in terms of if this is on the public agenda, that there needs to be some more coordinated communication with the public. I think particularly the potential producers like Quadrilla, I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of public engagement and I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg at the moment. But I think you can't, because this is a debate with varied points of view, no one single set of people has got the responsibility, but I think we need to get much more open debate in the public. And events like this, where we get a small audience, only scratch the surface, I think we need to use the global media with bigger events.
Yeah, I think all of us engaged in this have a responsibility to inform the public. I spent 33 years at the British Geological Survey, and it's organisations like that which are very much a public good, public role, independent organisation. I think they have a very important role because they need to present the evidence base. The problem is the evidence base isn't all that sexy for the media, so you tend to find that the public pick up their information from the things the media are more interested in portraying, like the burning sinks and things like that, and like, oh, they won't tell us what the chemicals are. So it is very difficult for people who are working from the technical evidence space, myself, to have the time in a soundbite to say something, whereas someone who wants to put fear or misinformation out can do it with no responsibility whatsoever and do it very well. A lot of the campaigners are extremely good at manipulating the media.
I'll not repeat what was already said, other than we have done a little bit of research on this, and it's interesting when you do that as to who do the public actually trust to hear the story from. And I can tell you straight up, they don't trust us because we're seen as having a vested interest, and we do. We're trying to develop this. But interestingly, they don't trust, these people who haven't made up their minds, they don't trust the NGOs either because of what Nick has just said, because some of the stories are so extreme that they think this is ridiculous, if there are legitimate arguments. They don't trust politicians. The people that they trust the most are probably some of the people in this room, and those are academics who are not seen as being tied to one particular viewpoint or another particular viewpoint. So although I agree there is a role, and there certainly is a role for Quadrilla, and by the way I have met with both Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, there is a role for us, and we try and play that role, albeit we are just not a giant corporation, we're a relatively small company. The role of academia is very important here because the public listen to that more.
Yeah, I would say something similar to echo those comments about academia. MPL sees its role as kind of getting the facts straight and then letting other people interpret them how they like with, policy or opinion. So we won't be commenting on whether it's a good or a bad thing to do. We're just measuring the emissions and quite grateful actually for working with Quadrilla, who are very open about giving us access to their site and allowing us to publish the papers on the data that we find.
Tim, perhaps I could just add with my IChemE hat on that I think the professional engineering institutions have a very important role to play, and the learner societies. But I think it's significant that there's been a large report from the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society that has been in the public domain for some time now. And I don't think that is the profile that it should in order to address some of these issues. So I agree entirely that what it requires is as near an independent benchmark as you can, but just having that report does not solve the problem. It's communication of that, and I think whilst the academics and the learner societies and professional institutions have a role to be more articulate and to expose this to the public, I think that needs to be in conjunction with the major stakeholders who have access to different outlets in terms of passing the message on.
And it's clearly an issue for the wider energy debate. It's not the only controversy in the energy field where there's a deficit of trust, and finding trusted bodies. I think hosting it here at Imperial College, there has to be an emphasis on what the academic can do within that debate. Thank you. I think perhaps the natural follow-on to that is perhaps talk a little bit about well integrity, and that's a question from the front, and the types of chemicals that are used.
Could I kick off with that, please?
Yeah, please do.
Because the issue of the chemicals that have been used, and the point you raised, comes from the US, where they certainly in the early days did not disclose and claim commercial confidentiality. That is not the case in the UK, although we have done very little. As you know, one well has been fractured. But in the UK, the Environment Agency have to approve what chemicals you put in your fracturing fluid, and they put it on their website. And if you want to find out what was put on the pre-salt, the one that was done, you can go to the Environment Agency website and see that. The Environment Agency have also said that they will only approve chemical additives that are non-hazardous to groundwater. So for our proposals in Lancashire, which are publicly available, we will use one chemical in the fracturing fluid, which is a friction reducer. And the reason we use that is when you pump water in sand 2 kilometers below the ground, you lose a lot of energy in friction. And this is called slick water, and it's non-hazardous, non-toxic chemical. The more interesting for me at any rate question is what comes back out of the ground, which is the flowback water. Now that does contain heavy metals. It's basically seawater that has been there. It was started at the bottom of the sea about 300 million years ago, and it's now 2 kilometers underneath the earth. So it was seawater. It's for a geologist like Nick, it's fascinating stuff. And it is very salty. It's about 4-5 times as salty as seawater, and it also contains heavy metals. And again, you can log on, and this is like things that people get really frightened about, like arsenic, lead, but in small quantities. And it contains naturally occurring radiation, and as soon as you say that, the public get concerned. But again, our workers on site don't have to wear any special protective equipment because the levels are low. It's classified as a non-hazardous radioactive substance. But again, it's all available. You can log on to the Environment Agency website, download the chemical composition of the flowback water from pre-salt, every single constituent. There's nothing hidden. And that will be the same for all future sites. On well integrity, we could talk about it all day, but I'll just make, and I won't dominate the conversation, just one very important distinction. Wells, like any engineering system, have multiple barriers against failure. Engineers are inherently conservative. I'm one myself. I'm sure there's lots in the room, and never rely on a single barrier. So people, and even the Refine report that Durham put out, said at the introduction, we are going to distinguish between well barrier failure, which is equivalent to one barrier, but you haven't lost the well integrity because you have other barriers, and well integrity, and then proceeded to lump the whole lot together into their stats. So people come up with this notion that half of all wells fail. There's been millions of wells drilled in the US. If half of those had failed, the countryside would be littered with oil and gas spewing everywhere. It's just not a fact. The stats on actual failure rates of wells are certainly not measured that well, I would say, but they are nowhere near the levels that you've probably read or heard in the press for that one reason alone. There are lots of other things we could talk about on well integrity.
I think there's some comments in the opening remarks, and I forget who, about the difference between emissions from the lower part and the horizontal drill and the upper part of the well, the near ground part. So if it's anything could help to clarify that a bit, it'd be useful, I think.
Well, I could say something about that. I mean, the whole issue of well integrity is, I think, not explained very well in the public domain, as Francis has said. I think the key here is regulation. And in this country, regulation is not prescriptive in saying that you have to do X, Y, and Z. It is the responsibility of the operator to demonstrate that the design of their well is designed to give essentially zero leaks and zero emissions. And I think this takes us into the smart completions that Jane referred to, where the practice may be in conventional oil and gas, where you might get a few percent gas emissions needs tightening up will be tightened up across the board, I think, in terms of having completions that give seals that give essentially zero leaks during the production process. And but there are several aspects to this. Wells age and the completion's age, and therefore you need good monitoring, and you need good remedial technology that as soon as that there's any indication that there's a problem, one can actually then go in and do remedial treatments that mean that there is no problem, that you detect things before they become a significant problem. The other issue in terms of leaks, I think, are out through the producing section, which is the horizontal well, where you actually perforate the wells to actually produce, to actually then do the fracturing and produce the gas from that section. And the concerns there are that you're going to get leakage into the groundwater system. And so that's also a matter of regulation. The design of the well takes into account all the geology and what's going to happen in terms of the extent of the fracturing, and that too can be monitored and closely controlled. So all the concerns about completions and well integrity, I think, are things that have got to be addressed. But I think my belief is that the industry, combined with proper regulation, has the technology to deliver the methane gas without significant emissions that are going to be harmful either to humans or to the atmosphere.
Do you want to pick up on that?
I just had a couple of very quick points. I'm very glad you asked the question, actually, because you made me realise I didn't make two things clear that I should have. What the first thing is, for all of the footprint studies that I was talking about, that's emissions to air. So, you know, when I was saying leaks, I mean in scientific terms, fugitive emissions in the air. Yes, some of those do come back through the flowback water, which brings me on to the second point I wanted to make clear, which is the way that the water is treated in the US is going to be quite different in the UK. There's lots of environmental regulation already in place in the UK that means that, for example, the flowback water can't be left in open evaporation ponds, which happens a lot in the US. And the evidence is that that's probably the cause, the major cause of a lot of the unmitigated emissions is these evaporation pools, which definitely will not be happening in the UK.
So the third question, I think we had a bit of trouble hearing clearly at the front, but
What was it? We should be careful about the partners we choose in. What? Okay. Well, I can't really comment on it because we're not involved in the LNG business at all. We don't buy LNG or produce LNG.
Nick, if you feel
Yeah,
like
can I just interject generally about LNG? If we don't produce our own gas within our own borders, we will have to import gas for several decades, and we already have very large LNG terminals. In fact, the first one in Britain was in the Thames Estuary at Canvey Island, which is now very huge. And it was deferred because of our North Sea gas production, and now has become important again. But the overall life cycle emissions from LNG compared to producing gas within our own borders is immense, especially if we import our LNG from hot countries. There's a rule of thumb, a rough rule of thumb, just to refrigerate the gas so you can get it into a seagoing LNG tanker. You're talking about 1 ton of CO2 emissions for every 5 tons of LNG that you refrigerate. Then, when you get it to here, you have to regas it. And we don't use seawater to regas our LNG here. We actually burn gas, believe it or not, to warm the gas up so it can go back in the grid. So there are emissions associated with that too, and the transportation. So, just think about, if you don't produce gas here, then you're going to be importing more LNG, and therefore, if your concern is about emissions to atmosphere of methane and CO2, one, if we produce our gas here, we can control our emissions, we can regulate it. If we import it from other countries, we haven't got any control over that. And LNG is more carbon intensive than pipe gas.
Okay, let's move on. Take another round of questions. I saw Lynn Wumby right behind you.
I'd just like to put a bit of perspective from a renewable energy standpoint. My company operates actually in this sector and large-scale renewables. There was a couple of things said. Secondly, it's a completely different investor base, so anybody's concerned about funds not being available for renewable energy if they go into shale, it's a completely different risk-reward profile. The two do not mix at all. So the one will not detract from the other. But from our experience of renewable energy projects, where we spend a lot of time on public relations and public dialogue, we have to accept that however well we do that, there's always a small but very vocal minority who are not interested in the facts and are just politically against that particular technology or that particular project. And the only way, well, you're never going to sway them, but the only way is to just get on and do it. And really, there will be a core who will always be opposed to this, whatever reports come out. And you've just got to get on and do it. You've got to, with Jane and the other independent bodies monitoring the first 10, 20, 30 test wells to prove that these scare stories are just scare stories. Francis mentioned one well he's drilled in Lancashire. There have been millions of wells fracked in the world. There's been over 200 in the UK. There's a lot of, this is not new technology, as mentioned before. It's a well understood. It isn't actually that complex.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm going to interpret that as a question in a moment. I think there's a lady right in the front here. Right, we'll deal with that, don't worry.
Legal in general have said that property values in areas within 2 miles of fracking sites could see a 25% drop in the value, and actuarial reports have stated that it's possible that homes and properties could become uninsurable if within a certain distance of a fracking well. I know we've talked about regulations, but obviously we also know that accidents are inevitable. Nothing is completely foolproof. Just want to know what provisions, like aside from regulations, are in place to protect homeowners and small businesses from the devaluation in their property values and any potential loans secured against any properties.
Okay, looking for third comment. I'm going to go to the gentleman on the far side.
Hello? Is this on? Yes. Okay. Yeah, my name is Alex. I work with the Sandbag Climate Campaign. We are an advocacy group lobbying the European Parliament for stronger climate change policy, and as such, any transition fuel is great to have. But that is neither here nor there in this question. I come to this question from my professional background prior to joining this Sandbag, which was as a political scientist, and I would like to raise the question of how the mechanics of the scare tactics of some groups work. The question was, or the issue was raised that the discussion is not non-confrontational enough, and that there ought to be more informed discussion. But I think the way Gasland as a movie works is that it raises 3 things. There were no there were all sorts of permits waived for the exploitation of shale gas. All of a sudden, you see these health issues. So the fact that the sink catches fire because of pre-existing methane is neither here nor there when people's hair is falling out. And then
and you should bring that round to a
yeah,
question.
yeah. The question is finally, what is being done in order to present to the British public that these aspects, which make Gasland work as a scare tactic, do not apply in the UK context? Because ultimately, that's why people are frightened. They're presented with an example, and they want to know that this is not going to happen here. So what is being communicated to them to prevent this from being effective? Thank you.
I'm going to pick up the first issue, which I think began certainly as is there competition for investment between the renewable sector and this sector, and perhaps how do those two sectors play over time? I think there were some comments in the opening remarks about the timescales over which we might see development of the two technologies. Are they strictly in competition, or are we pursuing?
I mean, I share the view that they're not. I mean, the evidence from the US, which is obviously had the most shale gas development, is that renewable solar and wind power has increased in percentage terms year on year in the US by over 20%, I think is the numbers, albeit from a low starting base. I think the investor groups are largely different. Interestingly, one of our principal investors, Riverstone, are also one of the largest investors in renewables. So you do find people who are prepared to invest in both, and they have billions invested across the piece. But there's no reason that they should compete. I mean, I think that is generally put up as a Punch and Judy show. You can do this or that. It's just a tyranny of the or. I'll come to the other questions.
I wonder, Geoff, if I could put you on the spot about timing on CCS. There were some remarks about the timescale over which renewables would develop to be a big fraction of electricity generation, perhaps. But over what timescales are we thinking that carbon capture technologies will start to make a real impact?
Well, the answer to that is largely political rather than technological, in that the technology is ready, and I think Nick referred to the fact that the UK has a competition at the moment, has two runners left, and they're both in the feed stage at the moment, design stage, and they will both come to fruition, I think. So we shall eventually have some commercial operation in this country. But I said a lot about the fact that I think the train is leaving, and unless we're on it, then we won't catch up quick enough, because I think if you look at the scale of what we need to meet the just the 10% of carbon mitigation by 2050 that's needed from carbon capture and storage, rather than something like the 10 or 15 global projects we've got now, including the UK ones, we need something like 3,000. So there's got to be a rapid acceleration in order to meet those targets. I believe that there will be a tipping point when we go from the exploratory stage we're at now, both technologically and commercially, to when, once it's proven and having benefits, then the industry will expand very rapidly. But I mean, if you ask me for a number, I would say that to get up, we're talking about 20, 35, 40 before it's really on the scale that we need to actually address just that fraction. And so all I'm talking about is the fraction of carbon emissions that we think we can capture, and that most of the scenarios say it's feasible to do by CCS.
Right, we had two questions which perhaps we'll roll up, and you can see how you can get on with answering. So there's one about impact on local populations, particularly in terms of property values, and what the proper response to that should be. And also, I think, provisions for protection for those communities. And I think the question is essentially if the tactics used in films like Gaslands were effective, what would the proper response to that be? I don't know who might want to take that. Francis, you're going first.
Yeah, I'll try and answer both. On the question of insurance, I mean, I'm not aware of anyone who's failed to get insurance, and the Association of British Insurers, in fact, say that there are no exclusions for insurance for fracturing. You may be able to show me evidence that there isn't. Property prices is a very interesting one. I'd be interested actually if you can send me the legal and general statement and who said it and what evidence they're basing it on, given that there has been no fracturing in the UK. It's clearly a forecast rather than a fact-based evidence. Yeah.
Based on the industry's, the insurance industry's expert risk analysis. I mean, if anybody in this country is an expert in risk analysis, it's the insurance industry.
Yeah, but and I don't dispute that. But as you well know, property prices are driven by a myriad of factors, and I can't forecast the property market. But what I can say is that what we will do will have no impact. There will be no damage to people's properties, no damage to people's health. Perceptions are what perceptions are. But I worked on a gas processing facility in Tallacra in North Wales, which is a small seaside town. It doubles in population in the summer, and BHP Billiton, the company I worked with at the time, put in a gas processing facility for about 200 million standard cubic feet of gas a day that is 40,000 part per million sulfur. This stuff makes shale gas look like drinking water. And there has been no devaluation of property prices there. And you can go there and visit it. And there are other examples. But it is a legitimate concern and something that we hear a lot, actually, when we go to communities. I can only say that I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We do need to get on, and the good thing about shale gas is that it is incremental. You know, we talk about developing 2 sites, then maybe 4, 6, 8. If the industry screws up on the first 2 sites, that'll be it. No. I mean, an earthquake, really. You know, it's. I think somebody compared it to a truck driving outside your house. I'm not saying it didn't have a big public relations impact, but in terms of the actual impact, you know, there are larger things every month in the UK not reported on. Sorry, let me just answer the second question. I mean, the Gasland. It was interesting that you say you could just forget the fact that you know, the tap thing was made up. I mean, for me, that puts a question on the credibility of the whole lot. That said, the way that we are trying to deal with it is through the environmental impact assessment process and the communication of that. So all the risks and the scope of that was decided by Lancashire County Council, and it covers emissions, it covers health, it covers seismicity, it covers water treatment, it covers fracturing fluid, it covers transport, noise, ecology. Log on to the LCC website, and if you're not a glutton for punishment, you don't want to read a full 4,500 pages, there's a 35-page non-technical summary, and then you can take it from there.
Witch Farm is in Poole Harbour. It's where BP developed horizontal drilling. It's the largest onshore oil field in Western Europe, and Sandbanks is right adjacent to it, and it has the highest property real estate value in the world, virtually. So a lot of these property issues are probably psychological, because people at Sandbanks weren't even aware stuff was underneath them. The Gaslands film, you mentioned, I agree with Francis, if you're going to discount the lie of the sink, and there was published evidence that groundwater there was contaminated before fracking, many decades before, and the film just run a cart and horses through that, and you claim there are other people saying their hair's fallen out, etc., etc. Just a couple of months ago, there was an environmental health atlas for the UK produced from this university, actually. If you go into Google and Google it, UK and England and Wales Environmental Health Atlas, and it covers all sorts of diseases from brain cancer to gastric cancer, tons and tons of diseases, and look at the statistical methods that they have to use to try and find out why there are clusters of diseases in certain areas and what associations and linkages they may have to industry or natural things in the environment. It is extremely difficult to do. So if someone claims their hair's fallen out because of fracking, I'm quite skeptical if it isn't done with a proper statistical approach.
Everyone's not that I'm saying this is true, but this is being claimed. So there needs to be a communication effort to demonstrate that the regulatory framework here is different from the one there. So
Okay.
people have nothing to
We had a bit of a discussion of public engagement right at the opening, but Geoff,
I
I think
just wanted to say that, in fact, I held a public debate with the producer of Gaslands at the Science Museum a couple of years ago, where they showed the film, and they had the producer on video from California, and myself, and we had a discussion where what you need to do with these situations is to put the evidence alongside the sensational portrayal of the risks and the consequences of it. As I said before, often with an audience we had there and an audience that we have tonight, it's quite an informed audience, and people are either not going to change their mind because they haven't changed positions, or they're willing to sit there and listen to the debate. We won't actually make inroads into the sensationalism that some of these programs and articles give, unless we can actually get it out into a broader debate with wider media rather than small meetings. But at least if we're having the debate in meetings like this, then we can actually project it into the bigger domain.
Good. Right, we'll keep moving. There was a gentleman here who's been very anxious to ask a question for a little while.
My name's Gordon Hunting, and I'm a stock exchange analyst. One of the comments which was made by Professor Maitland was there were two technology issues. He mentioned fracking, 50 years experience, but he didn't mention the second. Is it coal bed methane? And can he say whether that's more or less pollutive? The second question is of Dr. Riley. He said that fracking wasn't occurring in the UK. I think that's rubbish. Fracking occurs all the time in the North Sea part
I never
of...
said that fracking wasn't occurring in the UK. I said
You said since 2011 it
I said
hadn't
a frack
occurred.
test for shale gas, I said.
Well, shale gas
I
occurs...
didn't say fracking overall. Is
shale gas occurs in the North Sea.
Yeah, but no one's testing it.
They are.
We'll come back and deal with the questions in orderly fashion in a moment, I think. There's a lady towards the back there.
Bibba Hartigan, a communications consultant. Shale gas is being proposed as a transition fuel, and the 50-year transition proposed by Geoff Maitland seemed to be quite a lengthy one. Temporary measures have a tendency to become permanent. What measures are being proposed to ensure the obsolescence of shale gas, the fracking, before the resources are depleted and when renewable energy becomes more prevalent?
Okay, and one gentleman at the front here.
I'd like to revisit this issue of public education. I think the industry needs to point out that the shale gas that's being fracked is much deeper than the aquifers. There's no question of the fractures propagating all the way to the surface. And I think there's enough evidence to show that the water catching fire coming out of the tap, the source of that gas is surface gas, marsh, methane. And lastly, the wells are cased and cemented, so the leakage is probably negligible. And finally, how has this issue of public education been addressed in the US? Could we take a leaf out of their book? I mean, there's no discussion there, as far as I know.
Okay, let's try and we'll take those three questions. I think the first was whether the second technology was coal bed methane. That's very specific, Geoff.
I'm sorry, I realised as soon as I sat down that I hadn't mentioned the second technology. It's fracturing linked to horizontal wells. So, and it's often ignored that horizontal well technology is as much an enabler as the fracturing, because it enables the wells to actually go through the shale seams for long distances where your contact area is great, rather than puncture them like a dartboard, in which case the production would be very small. And the other advantage of horizontal wells, as Nick has pointed out, is that your actual wellhead can be in an area of low environmental damage and risk, and you can actually use that then to go and actually drill for large distances to where the source gas is. And so it's an environmental benefit, enabling you to, you've got not exactly independent choice, but you've got some choice of where you actually penetrate the surface compared with where you produce the gas. You asked about coal bed methane, and that's a whole different story, but I think that's probably, I'd say that we've got a lot of coal bed methane, and that falls into the same bag as shale gas.
I would disagree, actually. We have got some small production of coal bed methane in this country, very small. There's some in Cheshire, there's some near Stoke-on-Trent. I think the University of Keele uses coal bed methane. There, you're talking about coal seam gas, and there is horizontal drilling along those coal seams, and that opens up the coal cleat. Anybody look, probably most of you have never seen a piece of coal nowadays, but if you do get to see a piece of coal, you see it breaks up into these little rhomboidal shapes, and those fractures are what you use to open up in coal bed methane. And yes, they do inject water and proppants in, just as in shale gas, but coal seams are very thin. They're much nearer the surface. They're often in land that's already disturbed by previous coal mining, which is why some of the places in the UK are of interest, because those coals are already opened up, their fractures have been opened up by conventional mining. So shale gas is very different. It's much, much deeper down, and you're talking about a different type of rock which behaves in a mechanically very different way. It doesn't have all these cleat-shaped fractures in it. Also, in coal bed methane, you have to pump a lot of water out before you can even get the gas to flow. So there's a water disposal issue in coal bed methane. And the anti-frack people conflate coal bed methane with shale. Back to fracking, onshore UK, there has not been a frack test in shale done since 2011. Fracking has happened onshore and offshore for decades. I've been involved in the North Sea fracking in very tight gas formations. Some of the fields that are semi-conventional fields producing gas to this day, I was involved with that. But there may be someone doing some tests offshore, I don't know, in shales, but that would be commercial in confidence anyway.
I didn't mean to imply that the technology was the same for coal bed methane, but in fact it can be more benign. You can actually get a lot of coal bed methane out without fracturing because of the natural fracturing of the coal. But I mean, I think there's another source of gas that may be indigenous, then I think that we should explore that as well.
Okay. I'm quite keen to get on to the point about the shale portrayed as a transition technology. Well, go ahead. I might want to finesse that a bit as well.
Yeah, I was going to answer your question about, is there anything in place to stop us taking shale gas out of the ground and transition to renewables at some point? I think the main thing is the Climate Change Act. We've obviously got these overarching greenhouse gas targets that we need to meet, and the Committee on Climate Change, I think the government would agree that with the power sector, if our intermediate target is a 50% reduction, that doesn't mean 50% from the power sector. It means more from the power sector. I'm including heat in that. Because it's easier to reduce our emissions in the power sector than it is in some other sectors where it might be more difficult. And so they need to take on more of the burden. So I think that is the main overarching thing that's going to constrain our gas use in the future.
I thought it was a brilliant question, and I don't actually have an answer for it, but I mean, it cuts right to the heart of how do you make people change their what they do, and I'm not as optimistic as the Climate Change Act is going to do it, because unless you live in an authoritarian regime and you're in, maybe it's China or somewhere, and the government says this is going to happen and it happens, you have to persuade people to change their habits, and I don't think you get there by trying to scare the life out of them. And you don't get there by setting up other, Punch and Judy shows like we get now. It's either this or that. So I say it's a little ramble, and I don't have the answer. But I do believe that you won't get there through climate change acts alone. You have to persuade people what's in it for them. And no, you look at the UK's record on CO2 emissions. If you take net emissions, in other words, what we're actually the emissions we've exported to China along with our manufacturing base, we haven't reduced emissions at all. All this talk, all this negotiation, endless amount of conferences, and I don't mean to say that we shouldn't do it, but we're not actually achieving anything. And stopping shale gas isn't going to do it, I can tell you. We could choose to stop it tomorrow, believe me, it'll have, I believe, zero impact on CO2. It's a much bigger issue than that. Well, we would envisage a 20 to 30 year time frame from now. But for me, the UK, although important from a stature and an influencing point of view, is almost neither here nor there in global emissions. I mean, the big emitters are the US, China, India. And of those three, the only one that's actually doing anything is the US. And that's through market forces. Now, I'm not saying they can sustain that, because a lot of it is through gas displacing coal, and gas is clearly still a fossil fuel. But coal usage in the world is actually as high, if not higher, than it was in the 1960s. We think of coal as the last decade. Look at the stats. Even in the UK, we're burning more coal. 40% of our electricity coming from coal. Who's protesting outside a coal station?
I was just going to quickly come back to you. I think it's interesting that you don't think we're going to do anything based on the Climate Change Act, because I actually think in the short term, the Climate Change Act and our transition towards renewables provides two very good reasons to. This is my personal opinion now, to go for shale gas. One is the need for a consistent base load of power generation whilst we've got intermittent renewables, and the other is that we're just going to need to do something to reduce our emissions in the short term away from coal and oil. So it's interesting that you don't think that either of those two things are necessarily reasons to support the industry in the future.
No, I expressed myself very poorly. I don't think that it doesn't achieve anything, but I think to achieve, if people are talking, and they are, about zero CO2, that's a massive step change in our whole way of living. And to pretend that we can reduce energy consumption by 60% when everybody's on a smartphone, everybody's on the internet, we're actually increasing our energy consumption. This whole society is built on using energy. So if we're serious about it, we're talking about transforming the way we live. And focusing on shale gas in the UK is almost irrelevant.
I'd just like to broaden the question that you asked. I mean, I think the way that you persuade people to change their behaviour and their choices often is through their pocket. And at the moment, we don't have any economic drivers, as you've pointed out. The carbon markets have failed to actually change behaviour. So I believe that the solution to how quickly we transition should take into account the rate of development of the different technologies and our ability in individual countries and across the world to make the energy provision that is needed there, given the different sources and different geographical locations. Governments have got to be much more interventionist in making either the carbon taxes or the base level prices or the supplements to the carbon price, so that they can actually change behaviour by the way that people make choices according to energy costs. And I think a big block to this is, at the moment, a lot of the debate has been about how do we continue to actually reduce the carbon emissions, which we're not doing very successfully, but to do this at no cost. And I think the sooner governments can actually bite the political bullet and convey to people that we're going to have to pay, the days of cheap energy are over, we're going to have to pay more for energy in the future, whether it's conventional fossil fuels, unconventional fossil fuels, or renewables, and that if this is managed in the same way that the Stern report, which seems to have got largely buried, indicated, and do this in a gradual way, the pain will be far less than if we have to suddenly hike things in 2020, because we find that despite all the best intentions, people are not making the right decisions, and also the market is not making the right decisions in terms of what the energy balance is. And if you want to take it away from corporate government, I think something else that needs to be explored is personal carbon targets as a way of actually every individual realising that they have a contribution to make in terms of personal choices, and nobody else is going to make it for us. We're all in this together.
Okay. We've opened up a whole fresh area around the balance, perhaps, between instruments that government can use, such as the electricity market reform, calling for particular technologies, versus instruments that influence individual consumer behaviour. We'll see if someone picks that up as a question. Gentleman there, I saw your hand first. I'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Nick Allen. Quick question on prices for gas. Clearly, in the US, the advent of shales dropped gas prices from about, I think, $15 per million BTUs down to 2 or 3. Do you think it'd be possible to achieve similar reduction in gas prices here in the UK?
Okay, let's move on. We need, in the interest of time, to have brief questions. Gentleman at the front here.
Yeah, just I'm one of those people who you would call an anti-fracker, which I think is sort of unfair, really. I mean, I'd say most of us are just sceptical, and it's pretty fair for us to be so, really. Talk about us as if we're people who read the internet and just stupid, I think is really not a good way to get us on your side.
I don't think I said that.
Having said that, there's a number of points that you guys have picked up on, but I only want to make one question. Given some areas of the UK are already subject to drought and water use restrictions, what provisions will be in place to ensure fracking doesn't adversely affect our already limited water supplies? There was a report that came out from the States today equating $1.5 billion of shale oil with the amount of water used by 1 million people in a year, which is quite an extraordinary figure. We've all been hearing quite a lot recently, it's about the same as a golf course. So please don't use that from some press release, which is a bit embarrassing, really.
Well, we'll hear an answer shortly. And gentleman, Lynn, could you perhaps, in the interest of time, go to the gentleman in the front?
Andy Furlong from ICME. Very quick question. I'd like to ask the panel what they think about the quality of the political debate that's taking place around the fracking issue at the moment. Specifically, do you think the measures in the recent budget were sufficiently robust enough to move things forward? And I think I've heard the Labour Party toying with the idea of going pro-fracking, but saying you can't frack in national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty. So would that change the context of the political debate?
Okay, in order to keep things moving, I think if we run through the panel and see which of the three we want to pick up. So we had gas prices, influence on gas prices. We had aspects of drought and water usage volumes, and the quality of the political debate and the budget instruments. Jane, would you like to pick up that?
No,
You're allowed to pass.
One small point that I would make on is less the political debate, more the way that the government is handling the emissions element of things specifically. I think that they are being rightfully cautious. They're recommending more research. They're going to be funding a research programme to do all of the kinds of studies that I was talking about. And there's a research call out at the minute from the Technology Strategy Board, so run through the innovation department of the government to start to look into some of the things that I was talking about. So I think from the civil servant point of view, the right approach is being taken.
I've lost track of the number of times I've been told that my chairman, Lord Brown, has said that shale gas won't reduce gas prices, and it's never a good idea to contradict your chairman, and certainly not in public. I think when you talk about will it reduce prices, we need to set the context. I mean, the Hinkley Point nuclear power station, I think EDF have contracted at 3 times the current electricity price. Offshore wind is 3 times the current electricity price. Onshore wind is twice the current electricity price. Now, you can argue about whether there should be carbon taxes or not carbon taxes, but holding prices at the current level would be a good start. Whether it could reduce prices, I think it would have to probably happen on a European level, which is possible, technically possible. Whether there's a political and community will to do it is a completely separate question. But it certainly has the capacity to restrain prices, and in a market where prices are going up 2-3 times index linked, that would be a good thing.
We didn't manage to get a water resource specialist on the panel, but I would like, if you could, to give
firstly,
your answer to that.
I mean, I'm no problem that you're a skeptic. I think the fact that there are skeptics is a good thing, because every industry should be challenged. In terms, and I'm not going to use the golf club analogy. We purchase our water off United Utilities in Lancashire, and we're an industrial customer, same as any other industrial customer. So if there is a water shortage, we get cut off. The actual amount of water we use in absolute terms sounds a lot and is a lot, but in percentage terms it's very small, at least in Lancashire, and I live in Manchester, so if you live in the northwest you know how often it rains there. But the percentage, our demand for aside from United Utilities is about 0.5% of their daily supply. They actually lose a lot more in leakages. But if there wasn't sufficient water, we would get cut off. There's a huge incentive, nonetheless, in the industry to reduce its water consumption because we pay through the nose for it. And I would expect that if it goes into production phase, the flowback water will be recycled and reused. It doesn't have to be drinking quality water that's used for shale. It is at the moment, but it doesn't have to be. If there isn't enough water, we would be cut off like any other industrial customer before domestic. Domestic consumption is always protected.
And the water industry itself has put together a report. It doesn't see a problem really, because if shale gas does take off in this country, it's not going to go wham bang. It's going to progressively develop, and they think these are all manageable things. And as you correctly say, the Environment Agency has the power anyway to cut someone who's drawing water. You have to have a license to get the water, or a supplier who's got a license.
The supplier will cut you off.
Yeah. So I don't see it as a major issue at this stage in the UK with the speed at which shale gas is going. This is the cart before horse issues all the time, as I was saying. Let's just explore, see what we have, do some proper tests so that we can see whether we can actually produce this gas. And as regards gas prices, if we don't produce any shale gas, certainly shale gas will have no influence on gas prices whatsoever. But if we do produce our own gas, even if that gas is at the international market price, whatever that may be, and when you look at the geopolitical situation at the moment, that looks quite scary. And when you look at world consumption and requirements for gas, that also looks very scary. At least the money is staying within our country and being recycled within our country, rather than going to other countries, some of whom we don't particularly like. Thank you.
Political debate on some.
Oh.
So just on the water, I was going to point out that it's often forgotten that a lot of this water can be recycled, or you can reuse water from other processed water. And I think it just requires some lateral thinking in terms of how water generally can be recycled in different applications. That takes us to a much broader issue, that we're going to be talking about water in the same terms that we're now debating energy in a few decades' time. And the sooner we start thinking about being more efficient, and the fact that the amount of water used probably to produce the shale gas is comparable with the leaks is a driver to do something about that situation. I just wanted to say something about the level of political debate. At the moment, I think I would describe it as opportunistic, that where something fits with what politicians think voters will accept, such as, for instance, that we won't frack in areas of natural beauty, and so we can define national parks, but there's lots of other areas that we can't necessarily define, rather than actually looking at the evidence of A, the potential damage, is it an issue, and B, that there are many ways to access the shale gas without causing surface problems. One needs to make sure that the subsurface problems are properly managed and regulated. And I think we're not getting any discussion at all about decisions that are based on some of the reports that are being commissioned, and the government being part of the public mouthpiece of actually disseminating the evidence rather than simply using the bits of the evidence that fits their case.
Okay. We've reached the end of our allotted time, and I know some people will have to go, but I feel the questions are flowing freely. If we could have two very pithy questions, and we'll try to do something similar in, see now a forest of hands, and I've said two. What a disaster. There's a lady in the middle here who's been waiting some time.
Bringing it back to Imperial, my son's doing a postgrad in petroleum engineering here, and when he graduates, he'll be going off to Argentina to frack. So I just wondered, do you think there'll be good jobs for him and his like when he gets back? And what jobs do you think it will create? What kind of range of engineering skills will a growing shale sector produce? Certainly in Manchester, they were encouraging nuclear, and I'd rather do shale than nuclear.
Okay, and at the back.
Hi, Niall McDowell, Imperial College. I'd just like to sort of pick up on one of the comments that was made earlier about a transition to an eventual transition to renewable energy, and I just wonder, is that what the panel considers to be the most important aspect of this ultimate energy system, or is really the concern to be a low carbon energy system, which would include things like shale gas and other types of gas with the incorporation of CCS and things like that, as opposed to this sort of technology selective and restrictive kind of future, which effectively shuts down the investment case in some of these transitional technologies, which need a market that can endure for more than a couple of decades. I would appreciate the panel's opinion on that. Thanks.
Okay, so we have prospects of jobs and another cut of the transition question.
Shall I go with that one first then? Yes, I mean, I suppose maybe I said renewables, and I do mean low carbon, so nuclear would be included in that as well. My comment was more that there needs to be almost complete decarbonisation of the power sector eventually. And so when people talk about gas as a transition fuel, actually in the medium to longer term future, it isn't classed as low carbon and greenhouse gas terms. And that's why it's called, that's why it's being talked about as a transition fuel.
Yes, absolutely. It's just that when the debate is framed in the context of renewable energy, it sort of implies that there will be zero carbon fuel or zero fossil fuels being used in the energy landscape within 50, 60, 70 years or something like that, which is rather an ambitious policy, I think.
You've made your point. Francis, on either jobs or the transition question.
Well, Argentina's got some fantastic geology, and I suspect we'll have a hard job, and you might have a hard job attracting your son back to the UK if he goes to Argentina. South America is a fantastic place to live and work. But in terms of the types of jobs, I mean, clearly it's at a very early stage, but they range from the highly specialized and qualified geologists, geophysicists, petroleum engineers, all forms of engineering, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, down through technician levels, down through the people that construct the sites. So into a big part of it is water treatment, and of course then there's a huge amount of environmentalists. We have a lot of environmental engineers, health and safety engineers. It's quite a broad range of disciplines, but that's the same as the traditional oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry is populated with a lot of different disciplines, and people tend to be quite mobile and be able to work in different places. And shale gas, whether it happens or it doesn't happen in the UK, will certainly happen, and I hope it does happen in China for starters, because that would have the biggest impact on reducing CO2 emissions if they get their act together. And knowing the Chinese, they will probably get their act together. So there will be lots of opportunities. We hope to be able to create some here, but he'll not be short of a job.
I think it's as you say, very ambitious target, very difficult to get there. And I think if countries decide they won't have one particular technology, for instance, Germany, as I said in my talk, is phasing out nuclear. All the hard work they're doing to bring renewables on is just backfilling where nuclear is retreating. So they're not reducing their emissions. But in this country, I think we have to go down the most pragmatic route, and we need to do big things, not just lots of little things. And we also need to reduce energy demand. Interestingly, in Europe, road transport fuel consumption has dropped dramatically in this country too, and it can't be put down to the recession entirely. And this has been a big surprise to policymakers. So there are things that industry is already doing without any strong carbon credit incentives. It just makes sense to make more efficient cars and construct them more intelligently. But I think getting to a zero emission future will require global agreements. And when I look at the geopolitical issues we're facing at the moment, and we look at the Security Council in the UN and how just a few nations can't even agree on some really tragic things happening, I think I'm very sceptical that there will be global agreements to go to zero emissions, I'm afraid.
Geoff?
Yeah, I agree, Nick. I mean, I think the biggest problem here is political uncertainty, both globally and in the UK. Because as you point out, people, some of the transitional technologies, as they're called, and I believe they'll be longer term than merely transitional, are expensive and require a return and people need to know what they're investing in terms of the medium and long-term scenario. So I think until we have a proper energy strategy in this country, and there are uncertainties in terms of how we devise that, given the global interaction of that, then I think we will postpone some of these decisions, and we will have to become much more opportunistic and selective about particular technologies where there seems to be a local minimum or maximum in the return and minimum in the opposition to it being progressed, rather than being strategic in terms of the long term. Just on the jobs issue, short answer on that, I predict that by 2050, the shale gas and carbon capture and storage industries will be as big as the oil and gas industry. So in terms of employment and opportunities, I think they're huge.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. If you wanted a sentence or two to come in at the end. No, but Nick does. Three weeks turn down the opportunity, but Nick still has something to say.
Even though I'm sceptical, the future does have many, many surprises. And if we look back 50 years before now, at technologies we take for granted now, who would have predicted them? So I do have hope that ingenuity, research, academic and in industry, and if the UK can lead in that and show the way, I think that's fantastic. And I'd like to see a lot more money in research and development rather than subsidising technologies which don't deliver very much reduction in emissions and are extremely expensive. So if we could have some big breakthroughs in PV, big breakthroughs in energy storage, that would be wonderful.
Well, that was a crowd-pleasing remark, given the way you've come to talk. I would like to thank the audience for the quality of the questions and the range of the debate. I think we did manage to have an interesting, well-structured debate on a controversial issue. I was struck by the number of times that public perception, public engagement came up, but also the context of finding trusted bodies, perhaps the role of academia. But I think, as Geoff said, it's about not just having debate amongst a relatively small number of people, but getting out and trying to inform the wider public debate. So with that said, I'd like to thank very much the panel for giving over their time and feedback.